Hey, it's Jared. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to use manual mode on your Sony a7IV. Now, manual mode is a great setting to know and understand. Most of the images that you've seen that have been published online that are just really engaging images were shot in one form of the manual mode or manual assist modes that are available on your camera. So let's talk about those different modes really fast here. Manual mode itself is a fully manual mode where you are controlling the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO of your camera. I'll talk about what those are here in a second. Shutter priority mode and aperture priority mode are two different modes that you can use where one of those two, the aperture or the shutter, are fixed. You set your aperture or you set your shutter where you want it to be, and then the rest of the camera adjusts accordingly to produce a properly exposed image. And then of course, full automatic mode takes all of those things out of the question and allows the camera to make all of those settings adjustments. Now, the reason that you are unable to get those images with a beautiful faded background that is out of focus but still looks really great and your subject is perfectly exposed is likely because your camera is doing too much of the computation. It is trying to figure everything out. What your camera desires to do is to produce a properly exposed image based on the metering that it is doing. And by default, most of these cameras are looking at the entire scene that the sensor is able to capture, and it's trying to properly expose all of those things. And if you're outside or you're in an environment where lighting varies, the camera is going to be trying to do its best to find a happy medium between all of those things. How do I make the sky somewhat still look blue while making the subject somewhat exposed as well? There's a meeting in the middle somewhere there, and it's not always perfect. And so taking control of our camera and telling it what we want it to do so that we can get the intended effect is how we get beautiful images. And hopefully by the end of this video, and with some help of some other videos I'm going to recommend, you'll have a complete understanding of how to move forward in this way. So manual mode and these other assist modes are great modes to understand how they work and how to utilize them. The aperture is within your lens. It is the iris that opens and closes and lets more light in, or as it closes, lets less light in. And so that light that comes through your lens can be controlled there by the aperture. But it's not just a control of light, it's also a control of the depth of field. Those images where it seems like the subject it just pops off of the background because the background is so blurry and the fall off is just so shallow. That shallow depth of field is a result of a wide aperture. You can't really get a shallow depth of field with a small aperture. With a small aperture, you get a deeper depth of field. And so in images where a lot of the image is in focus from the foreground to the background, it's likely that the aperture was a lot smaller and a lot less light was let in as a result. So not only is the aperture controlling the amount of light coming through, but it's also controlling the depth of field in that image. Then we make it to the shutter. The shutter is controlling how long the sensor is exposed to that light that's coming through. And it operates kind of like doors that open and close. And as they open, all of that light can come through and hit the sensor. And then when it closes, no more light. And so when that shutter opens for a longer period of time, letting in more light, it is increasing the exposure of that image and making it brighter. Whereas a real fast open and close of the shutter is not letting in as much light. And so that light is going to have a lower exposure. And so in bright circumstances, a faster shutter speed is going to be required to get you a properly exposed image. In lower light situations, a slower shutter speed is going to be needed to let more light in and properly expose that image. But just like with the aperture, there is a cause and effect there that takes place. As that shutter opens, anything that takes place and moves while that shutter is opened potentially is going to be blurry. And that's because the camera is trying to create one freeze frame image out of whatever it's seeing, and any movement that takes place as that shutter is opened is going to result in a blurry image. How many times have you taken a photo either with your camera or maybe with your smartphone in a lower light situation, and you press the shutter and the camera clicks and you're like, what is it doing? And then it clicks to stop, looks like it stopped thinking. That is the shutter being opened for a long period of time to let as much light in. And then you see that image and you're like, it's all blurry. Shutter speed is too long. It's letting too much take place while the shutter is open and the sensor is capturing all of that movement. But on the flip side of that, a fast shutter speed is not letting a lot of light in, but in turn, it's also freezing the action that takes place as well, depending on the effect that you're going for. Just like with a shallow or a deep depth of field being kind of an effect that you're looking for in your image, the shutter speed also controls that effect. Not only is it a control of exposure and lighting, but it's a control of how sharp you want the elements in your image to be. Now, the ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. And so as you increase the sensitivity of the sensor, it is going to increase the exposure and brighten up the image. But it has limitations, and each camera has different limitations as to how far you can go with the ISO before that image starts to get grainy and you've gone beyond that sensor's capability to produce a nice clean image. And so artifacting and noise, color noise, and all sorts of stuff will start to enter your image if you boost that ISO too far. So for me personally, I use the ISO to get me to the exposure that I want while having the creative control using the other two settings. So the other two settings truly are creative control settings for both light and for the look and feel of the image you're going for, where the ISO helps you get there. If you need additional light, you can use the ISO to boost things up. So how do you adjust these? Well, by default, when you're in manual mode, your aperture is going to be controlled by this switch right here. So you can rotate it left and right with your finger, and you can see the change take place here on the back of the camera. As I pull my finger out away from the camera, I am darkening my image by making that number higher. And as I push my finger in towards the camera, rotating towards the lens, I am opening up that aperture and getting a wider aperture that would let in more light. Now, some cameras are backwards, and so depending on what make and model camera you have, this rotation could go either way. But in one direction, you are opening up the aperture. In the other direction, you're closing that down. Now, on this particular camera, the shutter speed is adjusted with this dial here on the back of the camera. And as I rotate it outward and away from the camera, I'm getting a higher number, which essentially darkens my image. And as I rotate it in towards the camera, I'm getting a lower number, essentially is a longer shutter. That shutter is going to be open for longer, letting in more light. The same finger movement, inward or outward, which makes it easy to remember and work it into the muscle memory so that when I'm out shooting, I can make these adjustments without even thinking like, oh, which direction am I going? I don't have to look because I do it often enough and remember that outward is darker, inward is brighter. Now we have the ISO, which is controlled here. You can press the dial to the right to get into ISO, and then you can rotate this dial to increase or decrease the ISO. Increasing that number to a higher number is increasing the sensitivity, which brings more light in. It makes the sensor more sensitive. And then decreasing that is taking us to a lower ISO number, which is decreasing the sensitivity of the sensor and rather than increasing it. And so those three settings there do need to be in some sort of a balance in order to get a properly exposed image. Well, where you should start is with the image that you want to capture in mind. If you're shooting pictures of something that potentially could be moving or slightly moving, perhaps a person that is trying their best to stand still but doesn't necessarily stand completely still, you need to have a shutter speed that is fast enough or high enough that it freezes that person so that you don't have blurry ears and eyes and nose and facial features. You want those things to be frozen and nice and sharp. So I tend to start out at around 1/125th to 1/60th, and then I can use my aperture to get creative control over that depth of field. A lot of times, especially with a lens like this that goes all the way down to 1.4, that's a very shallow depth of field and sometimes not a best option for a portrait or to get detail in an item that I'm taking pictures of. So I may want to go down to around f4, f5 or something like that to have a little bit of depth in my image. And these are settings that you're going to need to play around with, especially the depth of field, because the aperture controls the emotion of your image so much more often than the shutter speed does and even the ISO. So there's understanding what these settings do, but there's truly understanding how they work in real life. So I highly recommend my free Ditch Auto course because that goes into much more detail as to what this looks like. What does a shallow depth of field look like versus a deeper depth of field? What does a fast shutter speed versus a slow shutter speed look like? The course goes into that in much further detail. And I don't necessarily recommend diving straight into manual mode if you're only comfortable in automatic mode. You can use some of these other manual assist modes that allow you to perhaps go into shutter priority mode. You set your shutter at 1/160th because you're taking a portrait of a person and they might move a little bit and you want to make sure that you're letting enough light in but keeping them sharp at the same time, but then allowing the camera to manually adjust the aperture and the ISO. And I can easily just go into an automatic ISO mode as well and allow the camera to complete that. And then after you take that image, look at the settings that it produced. What aperture did it end up coming up with? And why do you think it had to come up with that aperture? If you were wanting a shallow depth of field, but the camera decided to go with an f8, it probably means that the day was just really bright outside, and your shutter speed probably needed to be a bit faster. It needed to be 1/500th of a second to let less light hit that sensor so that your aperture could be wider. So these manual assist modes are great at teaching and helping you learn how the camera works before going full manual. And then of course the aperture priority mode, allowing you to make changes to your aperture while the shutter speed responds accordingly, and of course the ISO as it needs to, so that it can create an image that is hopefully sharp and hopefully properly exposed. So those are great modes to get started with. But the goal is probably to shoot in manual mode where you're going to have most control. Not because these cameras are incapable in any way, but because you want consistency in your image. Controlling the settings of your camera means consistency in your image. If you're shooting a bunch of stuff and your camera is kind of jumping those settings around, you're going to have inconsistencies in your depth of field. You're going to have inconsistencies in motion blur that might be in the background. Those things are not going to be consistent across your images. And as you go and look through your series of images, they're going to feel different because the camera may have chosen different settings, and that's going to elicit a different look and feel in your image. Manual mode is the only option that a camera has to stay fixed with the settings and give you that creative control that also provides consistency across multiple images. So I hope that this video was helpful and it helped you kind of understand a little bit about how to use manual mode on your camera. I've got another recommendation for you, and that is my Sony a7IV Quick Start Guide. It's a full course on how to utilize this camera from start to finish. And by the time you finish that course, you'll have a complete understanding of how to shoot with this camera, both photo and video. I've got a link to that down in the description below. If there's any questions you have or anything I can answer for you, use the comment section down below this video. And make sure to thumbs up the video if you found it useful, and subscribe to the channel so you can be notified when I put out more content like this. But that's going to do it for today. I hope to see you back in another video soon. Take care.